Welcome to Talk Back. Today we have as our guest Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Harvard University. Professor Sachs has been extensively involved in policy advice to developing countries. He has been closely following the reform process in India. As director of the Center for International Development at Harvard, he has initiated a major program of research and advice to both the government of Tamil Nadu and the government of India. Welcome, Professor Sachs.
Thanks very much. Very nice to be here.
You know that we have been at it now for 10 years at reforms. And the first few years, there was tremendous optimism. The growth was doing well, and there was this belief that we could actually get to a 7.5% growth rate. And then more recently, there has been some disillusionment with that. What is your own assessment on how our growth prospects look?
Actually, I remember in the early days coming here and not hearing so much optimism, but hearing a lot of skepticism by academics and by others who said, oh, this market stuff, this won't work, can't work, India will go back to crisis. And in the early and mid-1990s, I said, aim for at least 6% growth. And people said, no, that's much above what we've ever had. And of course, India is now reliably achieving 6% growth. I'm pretty optimistic. I think that if the government and the states, which are very important now, can carry out the right kinds of reforms, the growth, which has been about 6%, could speed up, could be 8 or even 9% per year. And if that is accomplished, I think people would really feel quite a dramatic pull, quite a dramatic increase in living standards and economic prosperity widely spread.
It's interesting that you should say so, because the Prime Minister, in his speech on Independence Day in 2000, did say that we want to have as a national goal doubling of our GDP per capita income, doubling of our per capita income over a decade. And today there is a lot of skepticism on that. People are beginning to wonder if we can indeed achieve a 9% growth rate on average over the next 10 years. Would you say, or rather let me put it this way, what are the policies that you think are needed in order to achieve a 9% per year growth of GDP in India?
Let me say that I was very happy when I heard the Prime Minister make that statement about India's decade of development and that there could be a decade of doubling the average income. That would require per capita growth of about 7% per year. And as you say, if you add in population growth, that means the overall economy would have to expand somewhere around 9%. Is it possible? Definitely yes. A number of countries have achieved that. China, 2 decades in a row, has achieved that. Japan was the first country probably in modern history to have a doubling in a decade. In the 1960s, the Japanese government said, let's go for it. Let's double our income this decade. And lo and behold, they achieved it actually in less than 10 years. Korea also has been able to do it. So could India do it? No doubt in my mind. India's at 6% now. If the right kinds of policies are followed, if the country can get behind this goal, then I think it is possible to get up to 9% on average over the course of a decade.
How much of this would come from larger investments and how much from more productivity improvements in your view?
I think both quality and quantity, if you want to put it that way, are very important. But I think that it's important to recognize that India needs 2 kinds of reforms, in my opinion. One kind of reform is human development, as it's often called, which means helping through government policy for people to improve their health and their educational attainment. Because this is a country, after all, where still there's enormous illiteracy and a tremendous burden of disease. And every experience in the world shows that truly rapid and sustained growth has to be based on a healthy and educated population. So there's a lot to be achieved in that direction. Then there's a second side of reform, which is getting business investment and getting trade going and making markets work better. And I think those two pillars, a human pillar and the economic market pillar, are both critical to getting this kind of speed up and growth achieved. It's not so easy, though, because it costs some money. It requires a reorientation of priorities of the government. And so I don't think anything's automatic about this, but I do think if there's a focus on these two parts, the human development part and the business investment and liberalization part, it can be done.
Don't you think in a country like ours, where we have had a private sector which has really thrived on all the protection for all these years, suddenly you say that now, you must really compete and look at the globe as your market, and we have had a public sector which has really been controlled by the bureaucrats and the politicians, and suddenly we tell them, now you really pull your act together. How easy do you think that is?
Well, it can't be too easy because everybody would be doing it, so I wouldn't say that this is a simple matter. On the other hand, to achieve 6% growth per year is already pretty good, so it shows there's a lot more energy in this economy than some people suspect or say it sometimes. Now, take the case of China, which I think is really the only country in the world that you can justly compare with India. India's got a population of more than 1 billion now, China 1.3 billion people. And yet from 1980 until now, China's been averaging more than 10% per year economic growth. It's been absolutely spectacular. And one comparison that I would make with India is that since 1980, China's exports to world markets, a good measure of competitiveness, went from about $20 billion a year to $200 billion a year over 2 decades. 10-fold increase. What happened in India? From about 17 billion a year to about 35 billion a year, 2 times. So China did 10 times, India only 2 times. What does that prove? It proves that it's possible to make this great kind of breakthrough. It also proves India hasn't yet done it. India could and should be more export competitive as one of the premier goals for getting this kind of rapid growth. And government policy slowly has been promoting exports, but not with the kind of dynamism, for example, that China did.
To some extent, as we move towards the market, we are already seeing that there are regional differences in the drive for reforms, and as a result, you get different growth rates, and that is a cause of concern to many Indians. So how would you see that in the India-China comparison context? Do you think we can really follow that sort of a path?
Well, one thing that I have been studying very extensively in recent years is how geography affects economic development. It's a fact of life, not whether you like it or not, but just to understand it. And one of the key points about economic development is that it takes place on coasts more than it does in the far interior of a continent. In the United States, which is a big continent, but with the West Coast, the East Coast, and the South on the Gulf of Mexico, we have found in our studies that almost 70% of the economic activity and about that of population actually live near the coasts or near navigable seaways. What does this mean for India? What does it mean for China? In China, not because they focused on the coast so much, but because it's easier to do business on the coast, the coastal regions of China have boomed, while the interior regions have grown, but not as fast. In India, it's not so different. The coasts, which is the big southern part of this subcontinent, are speeding up faster than the high population regions of the north of the Ganges Valley. Fast growth in the south is going to help the rest of the country. Maybe the rest of the country in the next 3 or 4 years won't be growing quite as fast as some of the most dynamic southern states. I think that's probably a good bet. That's just how economics is. To hold back the South would be devastating. One has to think, so what can we do in the North? And I think there are things that need to be done in the North to help the process of economic development there as well, but not by holding back fast-growing regions.
What we find in our country is that the politically more powerful states are the backward states. Now, if that happens, then there is the process of democracy works in a way where there'll be a tendency to put a drag on this path of allowing, the better ones to keep growing. So in that context, what do you see as a solution?
Well, first I would say for the period from independence until 1991, India barely noticed that it had a coast, because the whole policy of the country was to close trade, and the ports didn't count for very much after all. And that's why all of India grew about the same rate, everybody very slow. So you can, even in a coastal economy, ruin economic growth, and that's what a lot of the policy did, because without international trade, it was very hard for India to have the dynamism. Since the reform started in 1991, growth has been picking up. It's been picking up all over the country, so we shouldn't exaggerate. It is true that growth is picking up more rapidly in the South, but it's also true that growth is faster in the northern states. All parts of the country are benefiting, but the coastal states are benefiting even more. I hope that in a democracy, the idea isn't to ruin your neighbor, but the idea is to say, how can this country best progress in the future and best achieve the goals that its citizens want? What do people want? They want rising living standards, and they want better social conditions. And as I said earlier, it's very important in any reform not to pretend that market liberalization is the beginning and the end. India needs social programs, health and education, which are desperately needed in Uttar Pradesh, for example, or in Bihar or Orissa, just as they are in other parts of the country. So if there's a full reform process that makes markets work better, makes trade go faster, but also addresses the health and the education needs, I think you'll find a widespread support throughout the entire country.
What do you think states like UP and Rajasthan and Bihar should do in order to catch up in this process of growth?
I think that all the states should be making their markets work better and giving a business environment where investment can take place. Let me say a word about what's really needed for faster economic growth. How do you get from 6 to 9%? What are the businesses saying? They're saying we need more infrastructure, we need power, we need water supply, we need the ports working better, and so forth. Why aren't those things present? Because the whole way that India has regulated these sectors has not really made sense. It hasn't allowed private investors to come in and make a profit by supplying electricity, by supplying water, by supplying port services. So India should take a cue from what a lot of other countries have done, and that is make the infrastructure sector, so-called, the power and ports and airports and so forth, open to competition, open to private investment, and instead of having everything dictated from Delhi, the states should have the authority to enter into these kinds of arrangements with private suppliers and decide on the kind of infrastructure that they need and they want, and to make the contracts, even international contracts. Many places right now are held back because the authority isn't yet there where it needs to be. So one thing I think is really important is more devolution of power, giving the states more authority. There's another part, which is that you can't get something for nothing. And this is the most problem. Well, I think they're both problems. Who's got the authority? But also, how do you get these investors really to come in? Investors won't come in if after they build the power plant, they can't charge for their power. And so there's a little bit of a pretense in India. Actually, it's in California too now, because there's a power crisis in California. And the pretense in both places is that consumers should get electricity for free, even though it costs money to produce. It's a wonderful deal. We'd all love to live in such a place where you get something for free. But the problem is that if you promise consumers, say farmers, free electricity, okay, you don't charge them, but there's also no electricity in the end. So there are massive power shortages all over the country. And when I speak to international businesses and say, why not go to India? They're very worried about the power situation. They're very worried about the port situation. They're very worried about the transport situation. None of these is a fundamental barrier. These are headaches that could be solved with some pretty straightforward economic policy changes. Charge appropriate prices, and instead of the central government deciding all of the infrastructure, let the states have more authority to do this as well. I think that's the magic combination that has worked in many other places.
I must put in a word for the government of India. I
Please.
think for the power sector, it would really be fair to say that a lot of the devolution has actually taken place, and where things are really stuck are at the level of the reform of the state electricity boards and privatization of distribution and taking care of transmission losses. And there what has happened is that the state governments have just not developed the political will to go up to the consumer and say, if you want this power, you have to pay for it. And then one thing leads to another. But you're quite right.
There's a lot of truth to that, but I'll give you two other examples. Airports, for example,
yes. And
where regional airports could be built, yes, privately invested, and somehow Air India or somebody else has said, no, that's our territory. That's one area. I'll tell you another area that's very interesting. I've seen good projects for internet connectivity and telephone in rural areas in Tamil Nadu, for example, with wonderful technologies that Indian scientists at the Indian Institute of Technology have developed. But to get them into the villages, they need approvals in Delhi. Up until now, this is finally changing. So Delhi has said, sure, now go ahead. It's an example of giving the power back to the local governments and thereby speeding the reforms. So I do believe that it is a mix of politicians truthfully telling their constituents, if you want power, if you want water, if you want these other things, there is a price because we can't provide this for free. But also empowering local politicians to say, yes, we hear the demand and we can make the arrangements without trying to run this extremely complex and enormous country from the center. Things are changing in both areas, but if you want to go from 6% growth to 9% growth, my main message is change faster.
Yes, I think I agree with that. But as you know, right now, our country has been struck by this natural calamity, the earthquake of Gujarat, and that has also really created a certain setback. But I do think that if the center really helps the state of Gujarat and we can regain the sort of, strength to get on with the reform process again, we will overcome that. But what is your view on this surcharge, for example, that the government of India has put on income tax in order to raise the resources to be able to rebuild from the devastation that has taken place in Gujarat?
Well, this is a terrible tragedy, and I hope it's not just the government of India that is helping, but I hope my own government, the United States, and the rest of the world will put in a lot of resources. When there are these huge international disasters, and this is one of the biggest in modern history, the whole world has to pitch in. This is something that India can't do by itself. And so when I get home, I'm going to really stress to our politicians that this is a world phenomenon that needs to be addressed by everybody. Now, of course, this is a terrible tragedy. It is not a barrier to the long-term development of India. It is a tragedy that requires rebuilding and requires this kind of effort. But by itself, it is not the kind of calamity that would stop the long-term development of the country. In terms of the overall budget, it's understandable, of course, that the government has to find some revenues to help the rebuilding. It's also true that in the broader sense, the whole budget process is a little bit of a mess right now because the budget deficit has remained very large in India for this whole reform decade. And what that means is the government has been borrowing year in and year out to pay its bills. And what that means is that the stock of debt, the total amount of debt that the government owes, has been growing. And what that means is that every year more and more taxes have to be used simply to pay the interest on the government debt. This is probably the biggest weakness of all right now. If this budget deficit continues, it's not that it's a calamity all of a sudden, but it is like a rot in the system that prevents the government from doing the things that it urgently needs to do. For example, I say, spend more money on education and health. And then the government comes back and says, yes, but we have to spend it on interest payments on the debt, which is a terrible problem. So the deficit really has to be reduced sharply so that this burden of debt stops growing, so that the government can save some of its precious tax revenues to use on things that are really urgent, like health and education. And getting that deficit under control is essential. That means finally getting rid of a lot of the waste in the system, cutting subsidies that are going to rich people as well as poor, rather than being targeted to those who really need them, cutting a huge bureaucracy, which actually costs a lot of money, and I'm not sure that it really is needed at this scale. Now that government is doing less things in many areas, the size of the bureaucracy can also be sharply reduced. Getting customers to pay for power and water rather than having the government cover that through borrowing. That's another part of this. So the first thing that, of course, I hope that this new budget does is make a major change of direction, finally.
But don't you think that by merely increasing the level of health spending, we are not going to take care of the health problem in India? Because the state of the public health system, the state of the primary health centers is so poor, the delivery mechanisms are really lacking. In that context, why is it when you acknowledge the fact that the fiscal deficit is very high, yet you keep talking about the need to spend more on health?
The sad fact is that India is one of the lowest spenders on basic health in the world from the government. The government's spending less than 1% of the national income on health, when the average or representative developing country spends about 3% or 3.5% of national income on health. Many countries spend 4 or 5%. If the health situation were good in India, then I would say, fine, you're getting good results for little money. But the health situation is not good in India. Infant mortality, death of young children, is extraordinarily high still. It's improved, but there's still more than 70 children for every 1,000 that are born don't live to the age of 1. This is a tragedy. We're seeing that the AIDS epidemic is spreading in India. And I've seen, and you've seen, the consequences in Africa, for example, where the epidemic was allowed to spread for 10 years, and then all of a sudden you find millions of people dying. We don't want that situation to happen in India. That has to be headed off. We've seen a resurgence of malaria, a disease that used to be under more control than it is right now. So there are urgent needs here. And when I toured the primary health centers of many of the states, even the southern states of India, which are relatively better off in this regard, you'd find that doctors aren't present, the doors are shut, the drugs aren't present, and so forth, a real breakdown of the system. Or you go to a primary health center and there's not a telephone, much less an internet connection or other things that you would need for modern health services. It's not a surprise that that's the situation, because if the government is spending less than 1% of national income, we're talking about government spending less than $4 per person per year on health. And that's just tragically low. Poor health leads to poor education outcomes. Poor education outcomes leads to poor productivity, poor economic growth, and poor people. So I don't think there is an escape from this. You simply have to make the health systems work better, and there's no way to do it at $4 per person per year.
But then let me get back to macroeconomics. You yourself mentioned that we really have not addressed the problem of reducing our fiscal deficit. So at the margin, if we see that the government is really not willing or able to cut the subsidies, then would you accept a higher fiscal deficit and have them spend more on health? Or what would you recommend in that sort of a context?
I would recommend that health and education should be guaranteed so that it's possible to be sure that a child born in India today can grow up to be healthy and productive for the future. Without investing in today's children, there is no future for any country. So I would say that is first and sacrosanct. Now I would say, what's the difference of keeping a child alive or having a wasteful subsidy on power that everybody steals the power and nobody pays for it? How would you balance those? I'd say cut those wasteful subsidies. Consumers of power all over the world should pay for it to guarantee that they have power. If you did that, you'd reduce the deficit, you'd give the government more revenue, and then it could make sure that the doctor is really in the clinic. It could make sure that the teacher is really in the school. And that's going to have such a bigger payoff than pretending that people can have electricity for nothing. So I really do believe that the wasteful subsidies should be cut, that the bureaucracy should be cut sharply, and I would make a rule. Anything that private investors can do, whether it's building an airport or building a port or building a major road, let them do it, because the government needs its scarce money to make sure that the clinics work and that the schools work. So my first rule is cut everything that isn't needed, cut absolutely every kind of investment that the private sector can provide, so that the government can do what it must do, because no private investor is going to make clinics for the poor, no private investor is going to make schools for the poor. Only the government can do that. Let the private investors do what they can do. And I think we would find a lot of saving and a lot of room if this waste could be eliminated and if government could refocus on this urgent health agenda. And I think the people would really like that. People say, well, that's tough politics. But what could be tougher politics than having families whose children are dying because there's no doctor present? I can't imagine anything tougher than that.
So what you're really saying is that if you can't reduce the role of government, at least drastically change the role of government and refocus the government's energies on health and education. And if you do that, and if you do market-oriented reforms, there's a good chance that you may actually double the average income of an Indian.
Well, I wish I could have said it as beautifully as you did, because that's exactly it. It's not to reduce government, it's to get government to do the things that it has to do and do it right.
So let the government focus on what only it can do.
That's right. If it had enough money to do everything, well, by all means, but we know how strapped for cash it is. So make it focus on the health and education agenda.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Thank you very much. We will be back on Talkback, same time, same day next week. Goodbye.